Okay, so we read Reading Lolita in Tehran by Azar Nafisi, and so our first topic is about the author herself. Like, who was she? When did she write the book?
So she was brought up in a kind of Western-ish family, and she was a teacher in Tehran, and
At the
at the
university.
university.
And she teaches English literature.
She wrote this book in 2003, but it was over a long period of time. We're not exactly sure when she was writing, but it was published in 2003.
There were a lot of different points in the book where she mentioned different time periods, so obviously it took a long time for her to write this.
It was post-revolution, definitely, though.
She had been to and from America several times, between America and Tehran, and she was in opposition groups in both places, and the book emphasizes that she led a book group, not exactly in protest. However, it was novels not that were not approved by the government.
The purpose was to study these books in a small group of women who were willing to look at Western culture and wanted to learn more so they could analyze the culture and analyze these books
For themselves, not to be told what it is by other people.
Summarizing the two parts of the book.
So, in Reading Lolita in Tehran, there are 7 characters in the book group, and they're a variety of girls. They're all girls. And there's 2 of them that are more Islamic. There's one who's more outgoing, but not Islamic, more secular, and disagrees with everyone else in a lot of points. And there's some characters who are just quiet and reading. And there's also one character who has issues with going in and out of jail for various reasons and abusive families, etc.
How does this book better help us understand Iran?
It helps us understand and see firsthand and kind of directly the differences between the groups in Iran, specifically the women, and how they were treated different than the people and required to wear certain clothing, and they were forced, and they didn't really have options.
Especially from pre-revolution to post-revolution, how Americans kind of just assumed that everyone under Islamic rule was always women had always had to wear veils, and they were always had these restrictions on them. But it actually is kind of the other way around, where they had more freedom, and then after the revolution, when Islamic rule took over, then women had to start having all these restrictions and wearing special clothes.
It also provides an insight to the women specifically, their opinions, and how it shows how the government really tries to cover that up and show that they are all kind of in this general idea and they all agree with the government, but that's not how it is.
It's interesting to note that this book they address stereotypes of both cultures. Like with reading The Great Gatsby in the book, they address the stereotypes of our culture that they hold in Iran. And we see stereotypes as terrorists when we look at Iran. So we're it kind of refutes all stereotypes and says, okay, this isn't really true. This is how this book presents them. And it shows us the truth really about what's really happening in Iran.
What do we learn about Iranian politics and government from this book?
Gives us a better understanding of what the revolution did. Before, we're oh, there was a revolution. It probably made them more secular, but in reality, it made them more conservative. And it was that's not how we usually picture revolutions.
Yeah, before the revolution, before we read the book, that we were just oh yeah, there was a debate in Iran, big deal, but we found that it was way more than that. It came in on people's lives and it completely changed the living style in terms of college students and just people in general specifically.
And specifically the control that the government had on the people, Like there is always a constant patrol of the Revolutionary Guard, like on the streets, and if they thought they saw a woman doing something that she wasn't supposed to, they would put her in prison.
Like talking with a man, not her brother or father or her husband.
Anything considered westernized.
And the government wasn't really consistent because they'd throw people in jail for nothing.
They would throw them in jail for just having westernized families or being related to someone with Western ideals. And they would keep them in jail for a month and then execute them to save time and money. It was very inconsistent.
Another thing about women specifically is that a few of them talked about how before the revolution they actually believed, like, you know, their belief was in Islam, and so they would wear the veils to show their commitment to the faith, but then once it became mandatory, they felt like their sense of pride and having that sort of individuality just completely stripped away, and they felt that, you know, it didn't really have a purpose anymore.
There was another story listed in the book that a man was convicted of crime because of his Western ideals, and they imprisoned him for 2 years in jail.
He was supposed to be let go after 3 years.
Yeah, but then they executed him, and then his family didn't find out till 3 days after the execution. So that, and it was all to like make more room, and just because they decided.
Well, and the charges laid on him were like completely ludicrous. The charges were being westernized. I mean, that's very, very vague in general, and I feel like they were just arresting them because they just wanted to keep that totalitarian control.
So politics in Iran, the people view the U.S. as a symbol of the West, and same with Switzerland. It's weird that they use Switzerland as a symbol, but when they talk about Switzerland, they're always talking about the West and their oppressors, and also same with U.S. flag burning. When they burn a flag, they're like, this is our independence, we're showing our opposition to the Western world, which they view as enemy of them, of their religion.
And it wasn't like only little bits of protesting or opposing the U.S. They would constantly yell out, like, "Death to America." There would be posters, like, in the airports and the schools. And
Burning American flags.
Yeah, you would see burning American flags, like, just on people's front lawns.
Because of these pressures around her, Nafisi, the author of this book, was forced to quit her teaching job because she was afraid that if she'd stay, she would get arrested or put in jail for having Western ideas.
Well, and then they wouldn't let her teach because she was a woman, and then after she was teaching, it took her 2 years before she could quit. They held her, like they told her she had to teach for 2 years before they allowed her to resign.
So that just shows that, like, it's very, like, the government and Iranian politics, they're very inconsistent. They don't really know what they want. They really only care about having control over the people, and they're not concerned with how it affects or what they look like, really.
Well, and even that part is a generalization of Iran because of how we as Americans perceive this book.
How does this book help us better understand The Great Gatsby, and do we agree with their interpretation?
Well, better than understanding The Great Gatsby, it was a better understand America in the 1920s, because that's basically what Great Gatsby was about, and it kind of put a bad sense on America, saying that, like, we were all party animals and America was all rich and America was very materialistic and nonchalant and they didn't care. And so that was Iran's view of The Great Gatsby in studying it, and
It gave America kind of a bad name because all they saw were the parties, the alcohol, the
music, the loud, the material, the shiny cars, and the big mansions.
Mm-hmm.
And it was specifically the revolutionaries' ideas, too. Like,
Yeah.
mainly the government's views.
Mm-hmm.
So I would not necessarily agree that that's all America was about. However, that was considered the Jazz Ages, and it was a rather kind of hectic time for America. It wasn't all materialistic, and so I would say as a group we don't necessarily agree with Iran's generalization of America.